Welcome back to another story on Infidelity Tales Lab. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Foundation of Trust. James Serrano had built his life on precision and control. At 42, he owned Serrano Construction, a company that had transformed the skyline of 3 counties with its signature steel and glass towers. His calloused hands could read blueprints like scripture, and his steel-gray eyes missed nothing on a job site. Workers respected him not just for his success, but for the quiet intensity that suggested crossing him would be a mistake. 20 years ago, he'd married Laura Leonard, a stunning redhead with emerald eyes who worked as a wedding planner. She'd been the daughter of the town's former police chief, Leonard, a man who died a hero's death in a gang shootout when Laura was just 18. James had fallen for her vulnerability, her need for protection, and her dreams of creating perfect moments for others. Their early years had been golden. James built their dream home on 10 acres outside town, a modern fortress with panoramic windows, a workshop larger than most houses, and a wine cellar that doubled as a safe room. Laura's business, Forever Moments, became the premier wedding planning service in the region. They seemed untouchable, but success breeds complacency, and complacency breeds blindness. The first crack appeared 6 months ago when James noticed Laura working later hours, taking calls in private, and being unusually protective of her phone. When he'd asked about it, she'd smiled that same radiant smile that had captured his heart and explained she was planning a celebrity wedding that required absolute discretion. "Trust me, honey," she'd said, running her fingers through his dark hair. "This contract will set us up for life." James had trusted her. Trust was the foundation of everything he'd built. The second crack came when he discovered she'd taken out a second mortgage on their home without telling him. When confronted, Laura had tears in her eyes as she explained that the celebrity client had required a substantial upfront investment for exclusive vendors. She'd handled it quietly to surprise him with the success. "I wanted to prove I could build something as impressive as your construction empire," she'd whispered against his chest. Again, James had trusted her. But this time, he'd begun watching. What he saw over the next weeks chilled him. Late-night texts that made her smile in ways she hadn't smiled at him in years. Phone calls where she'd lower her voice and step onto the balcony. Credit card statements showing expensive dinners at restaurants they'd never visited together. The third crack became a chasm when he hired a private investigator, Marvin Grimes, a former cop who specialized in matrimonial cases. The photos Marvin delivered were clinical and devastating. Laura entering a downtown hotel with Salvador Patton, a smooth-talking real estate developer who'd been circling James's more successful projects like a vulture for years. Salvador was everything James wasn't. Flashy where James was solid, charming where James was direct, and apparently irresistible where James had become predictable. The photos showed intimate dinners, weekend getaways, and worst of all, passionate embraces in hotel rooms that James's hard work had unknowingly funded. But James hadn't acted immediately. He was a planner, a builder who understood that lasting structures required solid foundations. If he was going to tear down his marriage, he needed to understand every support beam and weak point first. He'd spent weeks documenting everything. Bank records, phone logs, hotel receipts, and even recordings from listening devices he'd planted in Laura's car and office. The evidence painted a picture of a woman who'd been living a double life for over 8 months, funding her affair with their joint assets while planning to leave him for a man who promised her a lifestyle James's steady success couldn't match. The irony wasn't lost on him. Laura had been planning the destruction of their marriage with the same meticulous attention to detail she brought to her clients' wedding celebrations. The betrayal was as carefully orchestrated as any project James had ever managed. That's when he'd made his decision. If Laura wanted to destroy their marriage, he'd give her exactly what she wanted, but on his terms and with consequences she'd never imagined. James Serrano had built his reputation on delivering projects ahead of schedule and under budget. This project will be no different. Chapter 2. The Perfect Storm. The revelation of Laura's betrayal had transformed James from a trusting husband into something far more dangerous, a man with nothing left to lose and every resource at his disposal to exact justice. But before he could implement his plan, fate handed him an opportunity he couldn't have scripted better himself. It began with a phone call on a rain-soaked Thursday evening. Laura had been working late again, which James now knew meant she was at Salvador's penthouse apartment. The caller was Ethel Blackburn, Laura's mother, a bitter woman who'd never forgiven the world for taking her husband and had spent the last 24 years making everyone around her pay for her grief. "James, darling." Ethel's voice dripped with false sweetness through the phone. "I need to speak with you about something important. Can you come by tonight?" Ethel lived in the old Leonard family home, a Victorian monster on the wrong side of town that she'd let decay around her like her own spirit. When James arrived, he found her in the parlor, surrounded by her collection of porcelain dolls and newspaper clippings about her dead husband's heroics. "Sit down, James," she commanded, pouring herself another glass of gin. "We need to discuss Laura's future." "What about her future?" Ethel's laugh was sharp as broken glass. "Oh, don't play dumb with me. You think I don't know about Salvador? About their plans?" James kept his expression neutral, but internally his mind raced. "What plans?" "The wedding, you fool. They're planning to get married next month. A destination wedding in the Bahamas. Very romantic, very expensive." Ethel's eyes glittered with malicious satisfaction. "Laura's been using your money to fund the entire affair, including Salvador's gambling debts." This was new information. James had known about the affair, but not about immediate marriage plans or Salvador's financial problems. "How do you know this?" "Because she asked me to sell my house to help fund their new life together." Can you imagine? Asking me to give up the last piece of her father's memory so she can run off with some smooth-talking con man. Ethel leaned forward, her gin-soaked breath washing over James. "But here's what she doesn't know. I've done my own research on Mr. Salvador Patton." Ethel produced a manila folder thick with documents. "Your wife's boyfriend isn't just a real estate developer, James. He's a professional con man who specializes in targeting successful men's wives. You're not his first victim, and you won't be his last unless someone stops him." James flipped through the documents. Police reports from 3 other states, bankruptcy filings, and testimonials from other men who'd lost their wives and fortunes to Salvador's schemes. The pattern was always the same. Charm the wife, drain the joint assets, disappear after a quickie wedding, leaving both the original husband and the victimized wife broke and heartbroken. "Why are you telling me this?" James asked. Ethel's smile was pure venom. "Because Laura is about to destroy herself, and I want front row seats. But more importantly, I want Salvador Patton to pay for thinking he could use a Leonard woman as a disposable pawn in his games." That night, James sat in his workshop, surrounded by the tools of his trade, and formulated a plan that would make Salvador's previous cons look like child's play. If Salvador wanted to play games with other people's lives, James would teach him the rules of a much deadlier game. The first phase involved using Salvador's own greed against him. James began leaking information through construction industry contacts about a massive development project, a $50 million resort complex that required a specific type of real estate expertise. The bait was irresistible: quick profits, minimal oversight, and the kind of prestige project that would establish Salvador as a major player in the region. James made sure Salvador learned that Serrano Construction was the prime contractor and that the developer was actively seeking a real estate partner with Salvador's specific qualifications. The hook was set when James arranged for Salvador to accidentally encounter him at the country club bar. "Serrano." Salvador's voice boomed across the mahogany-paneled room. "Just the man I wanted to see. I hear you're working on something big." James looked up from his whiskey, his expression carefully neutral. "Salvador, I heard you and Laura were getting serious. Congratulations." Salvador's smile faltered for just a moment. Clearly, he hadn't expected James to know about their relationship. "Well, yes, we've been seeing each other. Laura's an amazing woman." "She is," James agreed. "Which is why I hope you'll treat her better than you treated Margaret Walsh in Denver or Susan Rodriguez in Phoenix." The color drained from Salvador's face. "I don't know what you're talking about." James stood, placing a 20 on the bar. Of course you don't. Just like you don't know anything about the oceanfront development project. Good luck with that, Salvador. I'm sure it'll work out exactly like your other ventures. As James walked away, he could feel Salvador's eyes burning into his back. The seeds of paranoia were planted. Now Salvador would spend sleepless nights wondering what James knew and what he was planning to do with that knowledge. But the real beauty of James's plan wasn't in what Salvador thought he knew. It was in what Salvador would do when his desperation peaked. Chapter 3. The Hammer Falls. 2 weeks later, Salvador's desperation had reached its crescendo. James's carefully orchestrated campaign of psychological warfare had worked perfectly. Through intermediaries and anonymous tips, he'd ensured that Salvador's creditors knew about his location. His gambling debts were called in early, and his few legitimate business deals began falling through due to routine background checks that revealed his previous schemes. Salvador was drowning, and Laura was his only lifeline to the money he needed to escape the closing net. But their planned wedding in the Bahamas required immediate access to substantial cash that was tied up in James's assets and couldn't be accessed without his cooperation or death. The plan Salvador and Laura hatched was desperate and sloppy, born from panic rather than careful consideration. They would stage a home invasion gone wrong, with Salvador playing the role of the hero who tried to save James but arrived too late. Laura would inherit everything. They'd liquidate the assets quickly and disappear to a non-extradition country before anyone could investigate too closely. What they didn't know was that James had anticipated this exact scenario. His home security system didn't just record video. It transmitted everything in real time to multiple secure servers. More importantly, he'd spent the last week preparing for their inevitable move. The attack came on a Saturday morning when Laura knew James would be alone in his workshop. She'd sent the housekeeping staff away early and made sure his usual Saturday golf game was canceled due to family obligations. Salvador entered through the side door that Laura had left unlocked, carrying a carpenter's hammer from James's own tool collection. James was ready. When Salvador crept into the workshop, he found James apparently absorbed in reviewing blueprints at his drafting table. Salvador raised the hammer, aiming for the killing blow that would solve all his problems. James moved at the last second. The hammer crashed into the drafting table instead of his skull, but Salvador's follow-up swing caught James across the temple, sending him sprawling to the concrete floor. Blood poured from the gash, and James's vision blurred as Salvador raised the hammer for another strike. "You should have just signed the papers when she asked," Salvador panted, his face twisted with desperate rage. "Should have made this easy." James rolled away from the next swing, his hand closing around a box cutter he'd strategically placed near the workbench. As Salvador brought the hammer down again, James swept the blade across his attacker's Achilles tendon. Salvador's scream echoed through the workshop as he collapsed, the hammer clattering across the floor. James struggled to his feet, blood streaming down his face, and looked down at the man who tried to kill him for money and a woman who'd already betrayed them both. "My wife's new boyfriend just shattered my skull with a hammer," James said into his phone, his voice deadly calm despite the blood loss. "I was half conscious, tried to call the ambulance." But before he could complete the call, Laura burst into the workshop. Her face was a mask of panic as she saw Salvador writhing on the floor and James standing over him with the phone. She snatched the phone from his bloodied hands. "It's just a scratch. You'll ruin our wedding plans." James stared at his wife, the woman he'd loved for 20 years, the woman he'd built a life with, the woman who'd just revealed that her primary concern wasn't his injury or even her lover's condition, but protecting their escape plan. At that moment, Ethel appeared in the doorway, drawn by Salvador's screams. She took in the scene with cold satisfaction before looking at her injured son-in-law. "Stop being such a crybaby weakling, James," she sneered. "Men have survived worse than a little bump on the head." James felt something inside him break. Not his skull, which throbbed with pain, but something deeper and more fundamental. The last vestige of the man who believed in trust and family and the bonds that held civilization together. They had no idea what he would do next. James looked at Salvador, still bleeding on his workshop floor. He looked at Laura, clutching the phone like it was her ticket to freedom. He looked at Ethel, whose bitter smile suggested she was enjoying the chaos she'd helped create. And then James smiled back, a cold, terrible expression that would haunt their nightmares for however long they had left to dream. "You're right," he said quietly, taking the phone back from Laura's suddenly nerveless fingers. "It is just a scratch." He ended the emergency call and turned off the phone completely. But attempted murder isn't. Chapter 4. The Architect of Ruin. 3 hours later, James sat in the emergency room as a doctor stitched the gash in his scalp. The official story was that he'd been injured in a workshop accident, a story that Salvador and Laura were only too eager to support once they understood the alternative James was offering. "Here's how this is going to work," James had explained to them as Salvador's bleeding slowly stopped with makeshift bandages. "You have two choices. Option 1. I call the police, show them the security footage of Salvador breaking in and attacking me with a hammer, and you both spend the next 20 years in prison. Option 2. You play along with my workshop accident story, and I let you live long enough to regret ever meeting each other." The choice had been easy for them. What they didn't understand was that James's mercy was not kindness. It was a much more elaborate form of justice. While the doctor worked on his stitches, James used his tablet to monitor the first phase of his real plan. His construction company employed some of the most skilled tradesmen in the state, men who owed their livelihoods to James's success and their loyalty to his fair treatment over the years. More importantly, several of them had backgrounds that made them uniquely qualified for specialized projects. Mickey Boyd had been a demolitions expert in the Army before joining Serrano Construction. Dean Anderson was a master electrician who'd worked black operations for a government contractor that didn't officially exist. Ronnie Keller had been a locksmith before discovering his talent for carpentry, and his old skills remained sharp. By the time James returned home that evening, his team had already begun their work. The security cameras had been upgraded with additional features that would record everything but only transmit what James wanted the outside world to see. The house's electrical system had been modified in ways that would be invisible to casual inspection, but would give James complete control over every light, lock, and appliance. Most importantly, the foundation of his home had been subtly altered. What appeared to be minor earthquake retrofitting was actually the installation of a sophisticated containment system. James's wine cellar, already designed as a safe room, had been expanded into something far more versatile. "How's the head?" Laura asked when he entered their bedroom. She was packing a suitcase with shaking hands, her earlier bravado replaced by a fear she couldn't quite understand. "It'll heal," James replied, watching her fold clothes with the desperate efficiency of someone planning to run. "Where are you going?" I thought maybe I should stay with my mother for a few days. While you recover." James nodded thoughtfully. "That's probably best. Give us both some time to think about our future." Laura's relief was palpable. She kissed his cheek, a gesture that felt like betrayal masquerading as affection, and hurried downstairs with her luggage. James watched from the window as she loaded her car and drove away, probably to comfort Salvador and plan their next move. They still thought they were playing the same game they'd always played: manipulation, seduction, and financial exploitation. They had no idea that James had changed the rules entirely. That night, James sat in his workshop, no longer surrounded by the tools of construction, but by the instruments of a much more precise craft. On his computer screen were detailed floor plans, not of buildings he intended to create, but of spaces he intended to control absolutely. The basement of the old Leonard house where Ethel lived was about to undergo some renovations. The penthouse apartment where Salvador had been staying was due for some electrical work, and the storage facility where Laura kept her business inventory needed some structural improvements. Each location would become a stage in an elaborate performance that would teach his betrayers the true meaning of powerlessness. They'd taken his trust, his money, and his safety. Now he would take their freedom, their hope, and finally, their lives, but not before they understood exactly what they'd lost and what they'd never had. James pulled up the security footage from that morning, watching Salvador creep through his home with murder in his eyes. He studied Laura's face as she snatched the phone, prioritizing their escape over his life. He replayed Ethel's sneer as she called him a weakling. By dawn, he had their fates planned down to the minute. The game was no longer about money or marriage or even justice. It was about showing three people who'd underestimated him exactly what a master builder could construct when he set his mind to creating hell on earth. Chapter 5. The Trap Springs. Salvador Patton discovered the first sign that his world was collapsing when he tried to access his offshore accounts the next morning. Every password had been changed, every security question had been altered, and every attempt to contact customer service resulted in automated messages claiming his accounts were under investigation for suspicious activity. The second sign came when he arrived at his penthouse to find the building's management waiting for him with an eviction notice. Apparently, his lease had been purchased by an unnamed corporation, and his residency was being terminated due to violations of the building's moral conduct clauses. The third sign was when Laura called him, sobbing hysterically. "Salvador, something's wrong. My mother won't answer her phone, and when I went to her house, all the locks have been changed. There's a notice on the door saying the property is under renovation by court order." Salvador's hands trembled as he held the phone. "Court order? What court order?" "I don't know. The notice says all inquiries should be directed to Serrano Construction, but that can't be right. James wouldn't. He couldn't." Laura's voice trailed off as the implications hit her. But James could, and he had. Using his connections in the construction industry and the local government, James had maneuvered all the pieces into position. Ethel's house had been declared a health hazard due to structural problems that had been mysteriously discovered during a routine inspection. Salvador's building had been sold to a shell company that James controlled through a network of business partnerships. And Laura's storage facility had been condemned due to electrical violations that hadn't existed the day before. The beautiful simplicity of it was that everything was completely legal. James hadn't broken any laws. He'd simply used his knowledge of building codes, zoning regulations, and municipal procedures to systematically dismantle their lives within the framework of legitimate bureaucracy. By noon, Salvador and Laura were homeless, penniless, and completely dependent on James's mercy for even the most basic necessities. Their bank accounts had been frozen, pending investigation into suspicious money transfers. Their credit cards had been canceled due to non-payment of debts that had suddenly appeared on their records. Even their cell phones had been disconnected for failure to pay bills that had been mysteriously redirected to addresses that didn't exist. James turned to look at her, and for a moment, she saw a flicker of the man she'd married. The man who'd loved her, protected her, built a life around her happiness. Then the flicker died, replaced by something cold and implacable. "Laura, 24 hours ago, you watched a man try to murder me with a hammer, and your primary concern was protecting your wedding plans. 8 hours ago, you were in a hotel room with that same man, planning how to liquidate my assets after my funeral. 2 hours ago, you called me crying for help with problems you created through your own betrayal." He walked back to his desk and pressed another button. The monitors shifted to show recorded conversations. Laura and Salvador planning the attack, discussing which assets would be easiest to convert to cash, even joking about how long they'd have to wait before it would be appropriate for the grieving widow to remarry. "This is who you are," James continued. "This is who you've always been. I just finally have clear vision." The trailer fell silent except for the hum of electronic equipment and the distant sound of construction machinery working through the night shift. Somewhere in that darkness, James's crew was building something that would serve purposes Salvador and Laura couldn't yet imagine. "Your education begins tomorrow," James announced. "Salvador, you'll report to the construction site at 6 a.m. Laura, you'll be relocating to specialized accommodations where you can reflect on the choices that brought you here." "What if we refuse?" Salvador asked, though his voice suggested he already knew the answer. James gestured toward the monitor showing the men outside. "Then your education will be much shorter and considerably more painful." As if on cue, the locks disengaged and the trailer door opened. The three men in suits stepped inside, their expressions professionally neutral, but their intent unmistakable. "These gentlemen will escort you to your new accommodations," James said. I suggest you use the time to consider how much you value the privileges you've taken for granted. Things like privacy, comfort, dignity, and hope. As Salvador and Laura were led away into the night, James returned his attention to the blueprints on his wall. Phase 1 of their education was complete. They now understood that their old lives were gone forever and that their survival depended entirely on his mercy. Phase 2 would teach them that mercy was not something he was inclined to provide. Chapter 7. The Classroom of Consequence. Salvador's first day as a laborer began at 4:30 a.m. in a windowless room that had once been a storage closet, but now served as his living quarters. The space was exactly 6 feet by 8 feet, large enough to contain a narrow cot, a bucket that served multiple purposes, and nothing else. The walls were concrete, the door was steel, and the single light bulb was controlled by someone else. When the door opened at 6 a.m. sharp, Salvador was escorted by Mickey Boyd, James's demolitions expert who traded his military fatigue for work clothes but retained the bearing of a man comfortable with violence. "Morning, sunshine," Mickey said with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Time to earn your keep." The construction site where Salvador would spend his days was a masterpiece of psychological architecture. James had designed it to be simultaneously a legitimate renovation project and an elaborate torture device that left no marks but broke spirits with mechanical precision. Salvador's first task was simple. Move a pile of concrete blocks from one side of the site to the other, stack them precisely according to a diagram, then move them back when the specifications changed. The blocks weighed 50 pounds each, and there were 200 of them. The work had to be completed by lunch, or there would be no lunch. Meanwhile, 3 miles away, Laura was beginning her own education in a space that had once been the basement of her mother's house. James's renovation had transformed it into something that resembled a luxury hotel room. If luxury hotels were designed by people who understood that comfort could be a weapon more effective than pain. The room was beautiful. Hardwood floors, expensive furniture, ambient lighting, and a view through one-way glass that showed her the garden where she'd played as a child. Everything she needed was provided. Gourmet meals delivered through a slot, designer clothes in her exact size, even books and magazines for entertainment. The psychological torture was in the perfection itself. She was living in luxury while knowing that every comfort was a gift from the man she'd betrayed, provided at his whim and revocable at his pleasure. The one-way glass meant she could see out, but knew she was being watched constantly. The beautiful room was still a cage, and the golden bars were somehow more degrading than iron ones would have been. On the third day, James visited her. He entered through a door she hadn't even known existed, blending seamlessly with the wall's wood paneling. He looked impeccable in a tailored suit, every inch the successful businessman she'd married, while she sat in silk pajamas that felt like a costume in her own prison. "How are you adjusting to your new accommodations?" he asked politely, as if inquiring about a hotel stay. Laura had spent 72 hours alternating between rage, despair, and bargaining with a god she wasn't sure was listening. Now, faced with James's clinical politeness, she felt something break inside her chest. "What do you want from me?" she whispered. James sat down across from her in a chair that hadn't been there moments before, another reminder that he controlled every aspect of her environment. "I want you to understand what you did," he said simply. "Not just the affair, not just the theft, but the fundamental violation of trust that made those things possible." He placed a tablet on the coffee table between them. The screen showed security footage from their home over the past 8 months. Her secret phone calls, her lies about working late, her stealing documents from his office to learn about his assets. "You see, Laura, I could forgive the affair. People fall out of love, marriages end, hearts change. I could even forgive the money. It's just paper, and I can always make more." The footage shifted to show her helping Salvador case their home, pointing out the location of safes, discussing James's routines, even suggesting the best time and method for the attack. "But this," James continued, his voice never rising above conversational level, "this is unforgivable. You didn't just stop loving me, Laura. You started planning my death." Laura tried to speak, but James held up a hand. "I'm not interested in excuses or explanations. I'm interested in education. Do you know what happened to your mother? The question hit Laura like a physical blow. Where is she? Is she alive? She's safe, James replied. She's living in a very comfortable facility that specializes in caring for people who've had psychological breaks. The shock of learning about your plans for my murder was quite traumatic for her, particularly when she realized that your inheritance would have included selling her childhood home to fund your escape. Laura stared at him in horror. You told her? They met at a diner on the outskirts of town, two people who'd thought they were predators discovering they'd been prey all along. This is impossible, Salvador muttered, stirring sugar into coffee he couldn't afford. No one person could coordinate all of this. Laura stared out the window at the construction crew working on a new shopping center across the street. The Serrano Construction logo was prominently displayed on every vehicle and piece of equipment. You don't know my husband, she whispered. When James builds something, it stays built. When he tears something down, she didn't finish the sentence. Their phones rang simultaneously, cheap prepaid devices that had been delivered to the diner with a note instructing them to answer immediately. James's voice was calm and conversational, as if he were discussing weekend plans rather than the systematic destruction of their lives. I hope you're enjoying your lunch. The coffee at Martha's Diner isn't great, but it's all you can afford now. I wanted to give you an update on your current situation. Salvador gripped the phone so tightly his knuckles went white. You son of a bitch, what have you done? I've given you exactly what you wanted, Salvador. Freedom from your previous obligations. Of course, freedom comes with certain costs, as you're discovering. James, Laura interrupted, her voice breaking. Please, we can work this out. We can fix this. James's laughter was soft and terrible. Fix what, Laura? Your affair? Your theft? Your attempt to have me murdered? Which part exactly do you think can be fixed? The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Here's what's going to happen, James continued. In 1 hour, you'll receive instructions on where to go. You'll follow those instructions exactly, or your current problems will seem like minor inconveniences compared to what comes next. Don't try to run. I own this town's infrastructure now, and there's nowhere you can hide that I won't find you. The line went dead. Salvador and Laura sat in stunned silence, the magnitude of their situation finally becoming clear. They'd thought they were executing a simple con, but they'd stumbled into a trap so elaborate and comprehensive that escape was impossible. 1 hour later, the instructions arrived, an address on the industrial side of town with a single line of additional text. Come alone, but come together. The education you've been lacking is about to begin. As they drove through the darkening streets toward an uncertain fate, neither Salvador nor Laura spoke. There was nothing left to say. They betrayed a man who built his life on precision and control, and now they were about to learn what happens when that precision and control are turned toward destruction. The address led them to a construction site surrounded by high fences and security cameras. The gate stood open, and floodlights illuminated a path leading to a trailer that served as the site office. They had no choice but to follow the path James had built for them, leading to a reckoning that would make their worst nightmares seem like pleasant dreams. Chapter 6. The Foundation of Fear. The construction trailer that Salvador and Laura entered was not what they expected. Instead of the typical chaos of a worksite office, they found themselves in a meticulously organized space that resembled a command center more than a temporary building. Multiple monitors displayed camera feeds from locations they recognized. Ethel's house, Salvador's former penthouse, Laura's business office, along with feeds from places they didn't recognize but suspected they would soon become familiar with. James sat behind a desk made from a massive slab of steel and concrete, a physical representation of the industry that had built his fortune and was now funding their destruction. His head wound was hidden beneath a dark bandage, but his gray eyes were clear and focused with an intensity that made both visitors instinctively step backward. Sit, he commanded, gesturing to two metal folding chairs positioned precisely 6 feet from his desk. When they hesitated, the lights in the trailer dimmed and the door locks engaged with an audible click. The message was clear. They would sit voluntarily, or they would be made to understand that their voluntary cooperation was the only illusion of control they had left. Let me explain your situation, James began, his voice carrying the same matter-of-fact tone he used when discussing construction schedules. Salvador, your gambling debts now total approximately $200,000, thanks to some recent investments I've made in your creditors' patience. The people you owe money to are no longer the civilized casino managers you're used to dealing with. They're considerably more direct in their collection methods. Salvador's face paled. You can't just. I can, and I have. James touched a button on his desk, and one of the monitors displayed a feed from outside the trailer. 3 large men in expensive suits stood next to a black sedan, clearly visible in the floodlights. They're waiting for my instructions. I can tell them you're not ready to discuss payment, or I can tell them you're ready to work off your debt in ways that don't require money. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had already consumed everything around it. James turned his attention to Laura. As for you, my dear wife, your situation is somewhat more complex. You see, when you forged my signature on those loan documents, you technically committed bank fraud. When you used our joint accounts to fund your affair, you committed theft. When you helped plan my murder, you became an accessory to attempted homicide. Laura's voice was barely a whisper. What do you want from us? James smiled, and the expression was more terrifying than any show of anger would have been. I want you to understand what you've lost. Both of you have spent your lives taking things that didn't belong to you. Money, trust, love, lives. You've never experienced being on the receiving end of that equation. He stood and walked to a wall-mounted blueprint that showed detailed construction plans. This is a restoration project I'm working on. It involves converting an old industrial building into a specialized training facility. The work requires very specific skills and absolute attention to detail. Salvador found his voice. What kind of training facility? The kind that teaches people the value of the things they've taken for granted. James traced a finger along the blueprint, following lines that showed a complex network of rooms, corridors, and what appear to be observation areas. You'll both be participating in this project, Salvador as a laborer, Laura as a subject study. The clinical detachment in his voice was more frightening than any emotional outburst could have been. James, please, Laura tried again. I know I made mistakes, but we can fix this. We can go back to the way things were. Laura looked up from the book she'd been pretending to read. A romance novel about true love conquering all obstacles, which James had selected with deliberate irony. The good news is that her psychological condition has stabilized. The bad news is that the stabilization involves a complete rejection of the daughter who betrayed everything she believed about family and love. He opened the folder and removed a single sheet of paper, a legal document written in formal language but clear in its intent. She's legally disowned you, Laura. Changed her will, revoked your power of attorney, and formally requested that you never contact her again. She's also provided testimony to the district attorney regarding your confession to her about planning my murder. Laura's hands shook as she read the document. Her mother's signature at the bottom was firm and clear, with none of the trembling uncertainty of age. This was a decision made with complete conviction. She wanted me to give you a message, James continued. She said to tell you that she raised a daughter to honor the Leonard family name. But that daughter died the day you chose money over marriage vows. The paper fell from Laura's nerveless fingers. Of course, James added, his tone becoming almost conversational, none of this has to be permanent. Family relationships can be rebuilt, trust can be restored, and people can find their way back to each other. Laura looked up with desperate hope. The process just requires complete honesty about past mistakes and genuine commitment to making amends. James's smile was gentle and terrible. Are you ready to begin that process, Laura? She nodded frantically, willing to agree to anything that might offer a path back to the life she destroyed. Excellent. We'll start tomorrow. As James left her alone with the ruins of her family relationships, Laura finally understood that her education was entering its final phase, the one where she would learn that some betrayals are too complete for forgiveness, and some bridges once burned, can never be rebuilt. Chapter 9. The Final Blueprint. 6 months later, James sat in his office overlooking the completed Riverside Rehabilitation Center, watching the sunrise paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. The facility was now operational, funded through a combination of government grants, private donations, and the liquidated assets of people who'd learned too late that actions have consequences. Salvador had become patient zero in the center's betrayal trauma treatment program. After 4 months of viewing testimonies from his victims, writing response letters, and participating in group therapy with other perpetrators, something fundamental had broken inside him. He now spent his days in productive catatonia, weaving baskets with mechanical precision while muttering apologies to people who weren't in the room. The psychiatrist called it a breakthrough. James called it justice. Salvador's gambling debts had been paid off through an innovative work release program that involved construction projects in countries that didn't ask many questions about worker safety or overtime regulations. He would never again have the opportunity to seduce vulnerable women or destroy trusting marriages, but he would live, in a manner of speaking, for many years to come. Laura's rehabilitation had taken a different path entirely. James entered her beautiful prison that morning to find her exactly where he'd left her the day before, sitting in the chair by the window, staring at the garden beyond the one-way glass with the hollow expression of someone who'd finally understood the magnitude of what they'd lost. "Good morning," James said, settling into his usual chair with the folder that contained her daily lesson. She didn't respond. She rarely spoke anymore. Not since the day 3 months ago when James had played her the recording of her mother's final message. The one where Ethel explained in precise, devastating detail why her daughter was dead to her and always would be. Today's lesson concerns the concept of redemption. James began, opening the folder to reveal photographs and documents. The question we're exploring is whether someone who's betrayed a sacred trust can ever truly make amends. The photographs showed scenes from the life Laura had destroyed, their wedding day, vacations they'd taken together, quiet moments of happiness captured when she'd still been capable of genuine emotion. Mixed among them were more recent images. James alone at charitable functions where they'd once appeared together, the empty space beside him in church where she used to sit, the dinner table set for one. "I've been giving this question considerable thought," James continued, "and I've reached some interesting conclusions." He placed a new document on the table between them, a death certificate bearing Laura's name and yesterday's date. According to the state records, Laura Leonard Serrano died in a single-car accident on Highway 15. The police report indicates she was driving erratically, possibly under the influence of grief over her husband's recent murder by her boyfriend. Very tragic, very final. Laura's eyes focused for the first time in weeks, staring at the certificate with growing horror. The woman sitting in this chair is now Alice Walton, a patient at our facility who suffered from severe dissociative identity disorder brought on by witnessing her husband's murder. She has no memory of her previous life, no family to claim her, and no legal identity beyond her patient records. James's voice remained calm and clinical as he explained the architecture of her new existence. Alice will live here for the rest of her natural life, receiving excellent care and treatment for her condition. She'll be comfortable, safe, and well-fed. She'll also be completely isolated from the outside world, with no visitors, no phone calls, and no mail except what the medical staff deems therapeutically appropriate. The beautiful room suddenly felt smaller, its luxury transformed into the appointments of a tomb. I showed her the recordings, the documents, the bank records. Your mother spent 24 years mourning a hero and dreaming of the day her daughter would find the kind of man worthy of the Leonard name. James's smile was sharp as winter sunlight. Learning that her daughter had become an accessory to murder was educational for her as well. The cruelty of it took Laura's breath away. James hadn't just imprisoned her. He destroyed her mother's faith in her, probably permanently. "You're a monster," she breathed. James considered this seriously. "Perhaps, but I'm a monster you created, Laura. Every lie you told, every dollar you stole, every moment you spent planning my death. You are building the man sitting across from you now." He stood to leave, then paused at the hidden door. "Salvador is learning about the value of honest work. Your mother is learning about the consequences of raising a child without moral boundaries. And you're learning about the luxury of safety and comfort, luxuries you were willing to take away from me permanently. The door sealed behind him, leaving Laura alone with the tablet and the footage of her own betrayal playing on an endless loop. Outside, James walked through the night air toward the construction site, where Salvador was discovering that 12-hour days of backbreaking labor were easier to endure than 12-hour nights of sleepless anticipation for the next day's suffering. The education of his betrayers was proceeding exactly according to plan. Chapter 8. The Weight of Revelation. 2 weeks into their re-education, Salvador had lost 15 pounds and developed calluses that would never fully heal, while Laura had gained a thorough understanding of how quickly luxury could become torture when seasoned with helplessness. But James's true lesson was just beginning. On a Tuesday morning that started like all the others, Salvador was midway through his daily task, digging foundation trenches with hand tools because the mechanical equipment was mysteriously always broken, when Mickey Boyd approached with an unusually grim expression. "Boss wants to see you," Mickey said. "Clean up first. You're going somewhere that requires better hygiene than this place." An hour later, Salvador sat in the back of a van with tinted windows, his wrists secured with zip ties and his ankles chained to the floor. The ride took 45 minutes, leading through parts of the state he'd never seen before, until they arrived at what appeared to be a private medical facility nestled in rolling hills far from any main roads. James was waiting in the lobby, dressed in a doctor's white coat that fit him perfectly and carried an ID badge identifying him as Dr. Serrano, Chief of Psychiatric Research. "Welcome to the Riverside Rehabilitation Center," James said pleasantly. "This facility specializes in treating patients who've suffered severe psychological trauma, often as a result of betrayal by trusted loved ones." Salvador was led through corridors lined with rooms where patients sat in various states of catatonic withdrawal. Some stared at walls, others rocked back and forth, and a few mumbled to themselves about trust and promises and the way people they'd loved had destroyed their lives. Each of these patients was recommended to our care by family members who felt traditional therapy wasn't sufficient for their conditions, James explained as they walked. "We specialize in helping people understand the long-term consequences of betrayal trauma." They stopped outside a room with a large observation window. Inside, a middle-aged woman sat motionless in a chair, staring at a wedding photo held in hands that trembled constantly. "Margaret Walsh," James said. "She was one of your earlier victims, Salvador. Her husband brought her here after she suffered a complete psychological breakdown following your disappearance with their life savings." Salvador's blood turned to ice water. The next room contained a younger man who'd arranged toy soldiers in precise formations on a table, only to knock them down and start over again in an endless cycle. "Robert Chun. His wife followed your playbook exactly. The affair, the financial theft, the staged disappearance. He was found 3 days later in his garage with the car running and a note apologizing for not being man enough to keep his wife happy." James's voice remained clinical and detached as they moved to the next room. "We saved him, of course, but as you can see, the recovery process is ongoing." Room after room revealed the hidden casualties of Salvador's career. Broken spouses, traumatized children, elderly parents who'd lost their homes and their faith in their children's love. The facility housed dozens of people whose lives had been collateral damage and Con Salvador had never looked back to examine. "The beauty of your operation," James continued, "was that you always moved on before seeing the real consequences. You got to enjoy the money and the excitement of the seduction without witnessing the suicides, the breakdowns, or the families torn apart by the revelation that love could be purchased and discarded like any other commodity." They entered a conference room where Salvador was seated at a table across from a panel of 3 individuals: a psychiatrist, a social worker, and someone identified only as a patient advocate. "Mr. Patton," the psychiatrist began, "we've brought you here to participate in a new treatment protocol we're developing. It's based on the theory that perpetrators of betrayal trauma can be rehabilitated through direct exposure to the consequences of their actions." A projector screen descended from the ceiling, and Salvador found himself watching video testimony from his victims, people he barely remembered, but who remembered him with crystalline clarity. They spoke about the dreams that had been destroyed, the trust that had been shattered, and the way his betrayal had poisoned every relationship they'd attempted since. The treatment requires you to observe these testimonies for 8 hours a day, the social worker explained. You'll then be asked to write detailed responses to each victim, explaining your understanding of how your actions affected their lives. And if I refuse? Salvador asked, though his voice had lost all its former confidence. The patient advocate smiled with the kind of professional warmth that radiated from predators disguised as caregivers. Oh, participation is entirely voluntary. Of course, your debt to our funding partners requires some form of payment, and manual labor was the only alternative arrangement we could negotiate. Salvador looked through the conference room window at the construction site visible in the distance, where prisoners in orange jumpsuits were breaking rocks under the supervision of guards with automatic weapons. I understand, he whispered. While Salvador was discovering the true cost of his career choices, Laura was receiving a visitor of her own. James entered her beautiful prison, carrying a manila folder and wearing an expression that somehow managed to be both sympathetic and merciless. I have news about your mother, he said, settling into the chair across from her. Is this redemption? James asked philosophically. Alice gets to live, which is more mercy than she showed me when she helped plan my murder. She gets comfort and safety, which is more than her victims usually receive. And she gets time, years and years of time, to reflect on the choices that led her here. He stood to leave, then paused at the hidden door. Of course, if Alice ever recovers her memory enough to remember who she used to be, the staff will interpret that as a psychological crisis requiring immediate intervention. We've found that electroconvulsive therapy is very effective at helping patients let go of traumatic memories. The door sealed behind him with the soft finality of a coffin lid closing. James walked through the facility's corridors, past rooms filled with people learning that betrayal was a luxury they could no longer afford. Some were genuine patients who'd been damaged by the Salvador Pattons of the world. Others were former predators undergoing the kind of rehabilitation that ensured they'd never hurt anyone again. The beauty of the system was its perfect justice. Everyone received exactly what they'd given others. Betrayers learned about trust, thieves learned about loss, and people who destroyed families discovered what it felt like to have their own identities dissolved completely. In his office, James reviewed the final reports from his legal team. The estate of James Serrano had been settled efficiently, with the surviving husband receiving everything according to the will they'd filed probate court. There had been no challenges to the inheritance, no suspicious inquiries, and no loose ends requiring attention. As far as the world knew, James was a widower who'd lost his wife in a tragic accident shortly after surviving a murder attempt by her lover. He'd channeled his grief into philanthropic work, funding mental health facilities for trauma victims and supporting legislation aimed at protecting families from financial predators. He was, by all accounts, a pillar of the community and an inspiration to other survivors of betrayal. James opened his desk drawer and removed a photograph. Himself and Laura on their wedding day, young and happy and still believing that love was enough to protect them from the world's cruelties. He studied her face in the picture, radiant with joy that had seemed genuine at the time, but now felt like the first lie in a relationship built on deception. For a moment, he almost felt something that might have been regret. Then he remembered the hammer falling toward his skull, his wife snatching the phone to protect her escape plan, and Ethel calling him a weakling for bleeding from an attempted murder. James closed the drawer and returned his attention to the construction plans for his next project. There were other predators in the world, other families being destroyed by people who thought